Howdy, and welcome back to Barebow Basics. To round out our conversation on components for your bow during setup, in this segment we're going to talk about the bowstring and some of the nuances that pertain specifically to competitive barebow archery. The bowstring is one of those things that most archers don't give a lot of consideration to, at least not until they start building them at home. This is especially true for beginners who purchase their bowstrings. They seldom scrutinize all the options available to them like they would with a riser or limbs or arrow shafts. Thankfully, this really doesn't matter and it's inconsequential because modern bowstring materials are so advanced that I'm going to bluntly tell you, you're not going to really see much of a differentiation in performance as a beginner, whether you choose an older material that's spectra-based and fast flight compliant, something that's a little more modern, that's 100% Dyneema, or something that's exotic, that's a Dyneema and Vectran blend for lower creep. So let your budget dictate what you want to buy, and it'll be okay if you use a fast flight string. Or splurge a little if you want to use something like 8125 or Dynaflight 97 that's 100% Dyneema. What does matter is how the bowstring is built. And there's three critical and important facets that I want to talk about in this segment that you should pay attention to as a competitive barebow archer. The first consideration is the bowstring's construction. And the most important facet of that is the bowstring's length. As you begin to shop around on the internet, you may find a chart similar to this one floating around. It helps you to understand what your AMO bow length is based on your riser and limb length combination choice. AMO is an abbreviation that stands for Archery Manufacturers and Merchants Organization. It's a set of standards that was put in place in the archery industry to try to help unify all the different manufacturers. So you shop for one item from a manufacturer and have it work with products from a different manufacturer. In this case, bowstrings and limbs and risers. The practical reality we found, though, is that with modern limb geometry, a bowstring set to the AMO bowstring length of 3 inches less than your AMO bow length tends to be too long. You end up having to put too many twists into the string in order to get to your ideal brace height. So if possible, try to have one made that is 3¼ inches shorter than your AMO bow length. This will put you much closer to your ideal brace height tuning range right out of the gate. The next aspect is how the bowstring is physically laid out. An endless loop bowstring is ideal. It allows for the most stability and least creep in your setup. But understanding what an endless loop string is really requires an understanding of how it's laid up on the jig. A bowstring jig is a series of pins set upon a rail. The string maker takes your spool of strand and wraps it in a continuous set of oval loops, hence the name endless loop. They stop when they reach the desired strand count and terminate the string with serving to create the limb tip loops. This is typically done with BCY Halo because BCY Halo is a very durable and abrasion resistant serving material, so it's ideal for limb tip loops. One limb tip loop should always be larger than the other because when you de-string your bow, you'll typically want to slide that larger loop down the limb for storage purposes. The next consideration is the main serving. And without question, the ideal material is BCY's Power Grip. While many recurve archers like BCY Halo for its slick properties, the danger in barebow is that if you're string walking and you take a crawl, that extra slipperiness can cause a slide during or throughout your shot. The little bit of extra texture in BCY's Power Grip serving material helps hold whatever crawl you designate during and throughout your shot. Additionally is the length and the position of your serving material. The World Archery Rulebook designates that the serving cannot in any way aid or help the archer in aiming. A few years back, there was an accusation leveled at a top archer, regarding the top position of their serving, which happen to come close to their eyesight. It is always better to ensure that your serving is well above your eyebrow so that no accusation can be made. This actually became a problem at Target Nationals this year for more than a few archers who had to scramble and adjust their servings because during equipment inspection, some judges found that the top of their serving was too close to their line of sight. So as a rule of thumb, I generally take my entire dominant shooting hand, put it above the nocking point, stick my thumb out, and start my serving there. That guarantees that regardless of what anchor I use, the top of my serving will always be above my eyebrow, like in this photo from Target Nationals. The bottom of your serving should continue all the way down to below where your arm guard would contact the string. This is generally close to the bottom of the grip or the stabilizer bushing on the back of the bow. This ensures that the strands of your bowstring don't take any unnecessary abrasion wear during shot release during your training. Lastly is the direction of the coil of the serving. While it's not critical which way it goes, I do have a preference. I tend to want the spiral to go along with the dominant hook hand. I'll explain that in the next section. The last consideration is the nocking point. Many archers consider the nocking point to be just something they tie on as a reference to where to nock their arrow. In barebow, though, the truth is your nocking point is a critical component of your tuning toolbox. An improperly tied nocking point severely limits your ability to make adjustments on the fly, as changes to your form or equipment setup may occur. Let's illustrate. If we think about the serving and the way it coils around the strands of your main string, more often than not, an archer will tie their nocking point in some fashion and dog it down really tight. This prevents any kind of mobility, which means if I ever need to adjust it, I can't easily do that. Instead, it is always better to tie your nocking point in such a way that the threads of the nocking point align with the coil of your main serving. This creates essentially a thread pattern, like a nut and a bolt, so that the nocking point can be spun up or down the serving as necessary for height adjustments. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the coil of your serving isn't critical, but that I did have a preference. For a right-handed archer, what would be considered a reverse thread coil is more ideal, because if at any point your tab rubs up against your nocking point, it will try to spin it up into the arrow, preventing any gap from being created below the nock. If you have a standard thread pattern, right hand twist, for a right-handed archer, any rub by the tab on the nocking point would actually make it spin down away from your nock, creating a gap. Now this is less of an issue when you're string walking with a crawl because your tab won't be anywhere near your nocking point. But on those setups, especially lower poundage ones where you may be touching the nocking point, having the correct coil on your serving becomes a very important factor in ensuring that a gap does not develop between your nock and your lower nocking point. For those of you who received a string where the serving coil doesn't match your preference, or those of you who just want to learn how to install a serving or tie nocking points, I've set up this demonstration to illustrate how I normally install a serving or tie a series of movable nocking points. The wood dowel represents the bare bowstring as it's strung above the riser, and the paracord will represent your serving material. Let's get started. Start by using the plunger holes to find the approximate location of the nocking point on the bare string. Then use your dominant hook hand and rest it on the bowstring above that spot, with your thumb extended up towards the top of the bow. This gives you an indication of where to start your serving. Typically, you'd use a tension serving tool with your BCY power grip. For this demonstration, we're going to use paracord wrapped on an old spool. Set your tag end on top of the bowstring and wrap with an over-under pattern, trapping the tag end against the bowstring. This might be sloppy at first, but do your best to keep the tag end trapped against the string nice so that you can pull on it to set the knot slightly. Continue wrapping using the tension from the serving tool, working your way down the bowstring, continuing to trap the tag end tightly against the bowstring. After you've covered about an inch of the bowstring, you'll be able to use a set of pliers and snug down the knot by pulling tightly on the tag end. This locks the knot in place so that you can continue working your way down the bowstring, reversing the tag end up towards the top and continuing the serving coil below the tag end as you work your way down towards the bottom of the bow. At some point, you'll want to come back and trim the tag end. I like to trim it a little bit short of flush so that there's a few fibers that I can then melt down with a lighter and press flat against the serving material. Once you've reached the bottom of the serving area, typically the bottom of your grip or slightly below, it's time to finish it off with a back serving. To do this, grab a loop, pass the serving tool over the string again, but instead of continuing down the bowstring, go through the loop, maintaining tension as you wrap the serving material upwards. I like to back serve about an inch worth of the bowstring typically. This gives me plenty of material to lock down the tag end. Take the tag end and hold it against the serving area and wrap the loop tightly across the top of it and the bowstring. As you do this, your back serving will unravel to feed your loop. As you maintain tension, continue wrapping the loop over and over, covering the tag end. On your final loop, you'll notice the tag end is now trapped nicely. And if we pull, we can snug down the back serving tightly. Again, use pliers to really dog it down. This will prevent it from coming apart. And cut just above flush to leave some fibers so you can melt it with a lighter. That completes your main serving. Now let's tie some movable knocking points. I like BCY Halo for my knocking point strand material, and I'm representing that with this green paracord. BCY Halo has that low friction, high durability characteristic that makes it an excellent candidate for knocking points. You'll also need an arrow shaft to assist with tying the knocking point. Place the arrow shaft against the serving material. Take one end of your strand of material, place it alongside this bundle. Begin wrapping just like you did when you started your serving. I like 7 to 8 wraps for the lower knocking point and 9 to 10 for the upper knocking point. Making the upper knocking point larger helps ensure that it won't move under the forces of arrow release. Once you've wrapped the suitable number of wraps, withdraw the arrow shaft as it creates a cavity that you can then feed the end of your strand through. If everything goes well, when you pull, the strands will stay together in a nice coiled fashion. Because we wrapped in the same direction that we wrapped our serving, the coil's made up like a thread pattern. With experience, you'll learn how much to pull on your two standing tag ends. The more you pull, the tighter it grabs. which means the less likely it will move. You want a certain amount of freedom so that you can twist it on the coils of your main serving. Once you've reached a desired amount of tension, cut your strands close to flush but not quite, leaving some fibers so that you can melt them down and lock it in place. I generally use my fingers to move the fibers as they're melting away from the main serving. This helps ensure you don't damage the serving thread. This completes a movable nocking point. You can now twist it, just like nuts on a threaded bolt, and move it up or down the bowstring as necessary when tuning your setup. Repeat for your second nocking point so that you can trap the arrow exactly where you want during your tuning. So there you have it, the basics of bowstrings that I feel every beginner should know. I especially stress to my students the importance of knowing how to quickly and proficiently repair an unraveling serving using a back serving, or retying a nocking point, because during an event, these failures do happen, and knowing how to do it quickly and calmly can make the difference between having a panic-inducing moment compared to just making the repair and moving on with your scoring. As always, thanks for watching, and I look forward to sharing more information with you in our next segment.